Welcome to our third segment of the discussions we're having on the defense of Wake Island in December of 1941. With us today, of course, is Lieutenant Colonel Charlie Harrison, who was one of the defenders on Wake Island. Charlie, you'll recall at the end of our second session, it was the 6th and 7th of December, a Saturday and a Sunday, there on Wake Island, when Major Devereaux and Commander Cunningham, the naval commander, decided to give the troops kind of a stand down for 36 hours. Everyone had been working hard, and so he gave everybody kind of what we used to call in the naval service a rope yarn Sunday. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Do you remember how you spent that particular time off?
Probably sleeping.
in your cot on your cot in Camp 1.
Yes.
You were garrison. Right. And that ended, of course, at Reveille on Monday, December 8th. Now, also on Sunday afternoon, the Pan American Clipper that was heading west arrived, and they remained overnight. And at dawn on the morning of the 8th, they loaded up their passengers and took off early in the morning, heading for Guam at that particular time. And then, do you remember you had a field music? You used to blow all the music calls.
Oh, Warnicki.
Warnicki.
Terrible.
Well,
everybody'd yell at him.
Especially at Reveille, did they?
Yes.
Well, he blew Reveille as usual at 0600 on the 8th. And I'm sure you all yelled back, and then slowly you probably worked your way up and going to the mess hall. Do you remember that?
Yes, I believe I do.
And I think they had pancakes and ham and eggs, I think, for the troops that morning. And then everyone kind of coming and going in and out of the mess hall. But around 6:40 or so, the air crew that had the communications back to Hickam received word that Hickam was under attack. And the officer in charge got that word to Major Devereaux, who was shaving in his tent. And he tried to call Commander Cunningham, was unable to reach him, but he called up the naval communication station, and they confirmed that Pearl Harbor was also under attack. And that was enough for Major Devereaux, and he ran over to the sergeant of the guard shack, and he told the sergeant of the guard to tell the field music to sound to arms. Do you remember?
Nobody knew what it was, but he did it.
Well, there's kind of an amusing side of that story. I think he got confused, and he blew about 3 or 4 different types of calls before he. Finally, everybody kind of got the idea that there was something going on. And then the officers and NCOs started mustering the troops and giving you direction. Do you remember?
Oh, yes.
In your case, it was Gunnery Sergeant Wright?
The big Wright. He was an enormous guy and a very fine NCO, staff NCO.
And I think his direction was like all of them, get back to your tents, get your rifles and ammunition, BARs, whatever it was.
To that effect, yeah.
And stand by to move out to your battle positions.
Right.
And shortly thereafter, then, you were loaded up on trucks. In your case, you went over to Peel, where your AA battery was located. And later, Major Devereaux was able to put in his memoirs that by 8 o'clock, in other words, within almost an hour and 10 minutes after he had gotten the word of the attack on Pearl Harbor, that all of the gun positions there on Wake Island had strong point positions, had reported that they were manned and ready.
Right.
So that was, and that's where it was. Now, also, you had a very famous fellow by the name of Warrant Officer Hamas. Do you remember Warrant?
John Hamas.
Can we have the next slide, please?
Pardon?
I'm going to ask for the slide, and you'll be able to see him on your monitor.
Yeah.
There he is as you look up at, Charlie, at your monitor.
Oh, I see it now.
There he is on some rifle range. What do you remember about Amos?
Oh, a number of things. He was, once you know him, you'd never forget him. He was a very impressive individual. And impressed, by that I mean, he impressed you as an ideal Marine, really. He was a great guy.
Had an unusual background. I believe he was Czech by origin and had served in the Austrian-Hungarian Army in World War I.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
And I think had become eventually a prisoner, and then afterwards in the 20s he migrated to the United States and joined the United States Marine Corps and served in the Banana Wars.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Could speak 5 languages, I believe.
I had heard that, yes. Mm-hmm.
But he was the ordnance officer for Devereux and the 1st Defense Battalion.
Mm-hmm.
And he started getting more ammunition supplies also to you out on the gun positions, I believe. I think it's probably worthwhile just to show our viewers. I'm going to turn to the map, and you can look at it at the monitor, but just to kind of show the major dispositions of where they were on the morning of 8 December on Wake Island. And if you can follow and see there on Peacock Point, that was A Battery. That was under Lieutenant Barneger. And then very close by was Battery E, which was the 4-gun battery for anti-aircraft. Plus they also had some 50 caliber and 30 caliber heavy machine guns at that. But Barneger was the strong point commander. Up on Wilkes Island, Captain Platt was the strong point commander. He actually commanded Battery H, which was the searchlight battery, which were distributed around. But he was located up there, and he had Lieutenant McAllister commanded the 2 5-inch batteries there. And then they also had 4-gun battery of AAs, but these were not manned. They didn't have enough troops to man those anti-aircraft. And we should remember that the 1st Defense Battalion was really an understrength battalion.
That's true.
Half of it was still in other places in the Pacific, and so there were lots of some of those weapons really didn't have enough troops there to man those positions. And then turning to the 3rd strong point up here on Peel, this was your position, and this is where your Battery D was located very close to the Battery B of the under Lieutenant Kessler. Was of the 5 inches.
That's right.
And then Devereux had a very small reserve under Lieutenant Hanna, who commanded the 50 caliber machine guns, and then Lieutenant Poindexter, who had the heavy 30 guns, and they were located right there near Camp 1, and just to the east side of Camp 1 was Devereux CP that was right up there looking over the south side.
First Sergeant Agar, I believe.
When they got the word about Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant or Commander Cunningham was very quickly radioed the Pan Am flight that was heading to Guam and told them to return to Wake immediately, which that Pan Am flight didn't return. And now, Major Devereux had also put a couple of air watch people standing up on the air tower. So everybody was kind of either preparing positions or on full alert. I believe you were working on a director at that on Battery D there, and you had to be up on full alert. And the BM F-211 had 2 planes out, Major Putnam with him. He came back, and then he wanted to keep 4 planes up at all times, and the balance who were there on the airfield, he had them distributed and dispersed as widely as he could because there were no revetments for those other airplanes. And there was a former Navy officer who was the pilot for that Pan Am, and he agreed to go out on an air patrol. So they offloaded all their passengers, and they were getting briefed on them. They were going to have two planes, F-4s, who were going to escort that Pan Am flight out. And this brings us up to just about 11:55 in the morning. And at that particular time, may I have the next slide, please?
They what?
Now I'm going to have the next slide. If you look at the monitor,
I see. Yeah.
you'll see there depicted a flight of Japanese bombers. This was a flight of 34 on this morning that were coming in
About 21,000 feet.
well, they started in at about that high, but then they dropped down.
Yes.
Before they came into wake, and dropped down to almost between 1,500 and 1,000 feet. And tell us what happened as you remember then.
Well, I was looking through a 24-power scope on the director, so I got first-hand view of everything. It was kind of scary, really. You could see what was happening. They're opening the bomb bays, and we're going to get it.
Now, did the alarms go off at that time? What was the means? I know that they only had sound power phones to the various points. Did every point have kind of a air alarm system, and was that sounded at that time? And
You know, I can't remember that.
but
I'm sure we had it.
somebody on your position thought that they were coming in so low that they were going to land. They had
That was Kenny Marvin. And then as they dropped their bombs, he yelled, "Hey, their wheels are falling off."
But those were the first bombs to come down.
Right.
And that was a pretty destructive day that day.
It was indeed.
First of all, they were very, very close to the ground, which reduced the effectiveness of your 3-inch
We couldn't
AA
elevate.
guns. You
right.
couldn't elevate them that far. Plus, you couldn't cut the fuses broad enough to go off.
That's right.
And about the only effective weapons they had were the 50 caliber machine guns, I believe.
Thank God for them. They were good.
And they came through a rain squall, as I understand it, so they
Yes,
weren't
that's
singing
true.
until just the last minute. Plus, that pounding surf also had drowned out the engines of their
true.
planes coming in.
Yeah.
And so the planes weren't over the wake very long. I think the history shows that they were only over about 8 minutes. But in that 8 minutes, they really wreaked havoc on the Wake Island defenders there.
That's true.
And initially they concentrated on the airfield, and then eventually went over and pretty much demolished the old Pan Am Hotel, I think. But that was where they concentrated most of their effort. Can I have the next slide, please? And you can see that on this slide up here, Charlie. That shows, because among other things, they had about a 25,000 gallon fuel dump over by the airfield.
I remember that.
And these were probably taken by Japanese pilots as they were flying off.
It was all in 50-gallon drums, as I remember.
Well, they did have all those dispersed, but they also had a fuel tank that had about 25,000 gallons.
Yes.
And that was set ablaze. I don't know if they were able to eventually extinguish that or not.
I don't remember.
But more importantly, they also destroyed, of the 8 planes on the ground, 7 were completely destroyed, and the 8th one was partially damaged, which only, after they got that going, they only had five planes left in VMF 211. They also lost they lost 2 pilots who were trying to get into their planes. They were killed along with 21 other squadron people. So VMF 211 lost about 60% of its fighting force on that first day. So things looked pretty good. As a result of that, surprisingly, though, the Pan Am Clipper was not damaged. It only had very slight damage, and the pilot got permission to load up all the civilians on the Pan Am, and they eventually took off with about 66 passengers.
Barely made it.
And they said it took them three ties, and barely got off the ground, and eventually worked their way back to San Francisco. By now, you see, you had Dr. Kahn,
Dr. Kahn.
and the Morrison Knutson was Dr. Kahn, and they came together, and so all the wounded were being treated over at tent camp, or at camp number 2, which was the Morrison Knutson camp.
I wonder if Dr. Kahn's still alive. He performed some miracles.
He must have. Now, after this was done, why, of course, the Morrison Knutson people really came out and lent a hand in helping fortify, building revetments for the remaining planes. And Lieutenant Kinney was put in charge of the maintenance in order to keep those planes flying. Can I have that next slide, please? And here you see a revetment that was covered so they could work under hours of darkness. But they worked miracles, stripping out whatever parts they could off the damaged aircraft in order to keep those last 5 flying all the time.
Some aircraft out of junk.
And Dan Teeters and his crew also took over the feeding for the garrison out of their kitchens, and about 86 of them helped man some of the weapons of the 1st Defense Battalion.
That's true.
Plus others helped building revetments and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So this kind of became the routine now for the next couple of days of being under air attack. On day 4, for example, on day 2, again, they always seemed to come in about noon, because they had to come in and would fly in. And by now, though, they were giving a little bit more respect. They flew at a higher altitude, and by now VMF 211 was downing a couple, plus your AA fire was also very effectively bringing down some bombers on the next couple of days. On day 3, on the 10th, 27 bombers came in and really worked over Wilkes Island pretty well. And the Morrison Knutson had a very large storage shed over there in which they kept all their dynamite.
Oh, yeah, and it blew up.
It had a direct hit, and 120 tons of dynamite.
That was quite a boom.
Amazingly, though, no one was actually injured on that. I think it did damage the rangefinder for the 5-inch battery, but that was it. And now we're going to turn, Charlie, to day 4 of the siege, which is on the 11th. And I'm sure you'll remember that day, on the 11th of December, because the Japanese admiral on Truk had decided that Wake had been sufficiently punished, and he ordered that the island be taken by the Naval Amphibious Force on the 11th. And this was
repelled.
Assigned to Admiral Kachioka, who flew his flag. Can I have the next slide? From this cruiser, which was known as the Yubari.
Oh, yes.
And he had at his disposal 3 light cruisers, 6 old destroyers, 2 patrol boats, transport ships that were carrying some 450 Japanese naval landing forces, or the equivalent of Marines, as we know. They were called the Riksentai. And they came off Wake Island at about 0300 on the 11th, and apparently were picked up. Devereaux told everybody not to respond or anything like that, but they were standing off until they eventually started to close in close to the island around 5:30 in the morning. And I'm going to ask that this next slide be put on. And this is going to show, going from right to left, the movement of those ships as they got closer and closer. And all the time, Devereaux told everybody to hold their fire.
I remember
but by 0600, the Yubari and his other ships, a couple of cruisers, destroyers, had closed to within anywhere from 4,000 to 6,000 yards.
He was smart. He waited until they got right where he wanted them.
But all the gunners were thinking, boy, they thought they were going to come in and dock those ships.
I remember guys cussing them. What's wrong with him? Why doesn't he open fire?
Yeah. And still he held their fire until about 0630, and then he turns to Colonel or Major Potter, who was executive officer, who had command of the shore batteries, and gave them the authority to go ahead and open fire. And by this time, a battery, which was, if I go back to that slide of where they were, going over to the right. No, go back to the map, please. Go back to that. No, next slide. That's it. Just hang on to that one. That one on the right shows the Ubari, which was off. A battery engaged it and got 4 rounds through its hull before it could turn around and steam out of there.
I remember that. I
And
saw
a
that.
destroyer came up and threw some smoke screen in order to cover it, but that was kind of unsuccessfully. And meanwhile, there was about 4,000 yards off. There was other cruisers and destroyers, which were being engaged by Battery L out there on the Wilkes, and they got rounds into the a Japanese destroyer by the name of the Yati, and really sank that ship, and it went down with all hands almost right away. Plus other hits on another cruiser and another destroyer. And where you were up there, why Battery B also engaged another cruiser and got hit on its fantail almost right away. So we got hits all over right away against that naval task force, including some of the transports. Do you remember being able to witness that where you were?
Yes, I remember one ship took a direct hit and broke half in two.
Yep, that was and sank right away with all hands.
Right.
And then, as a matter of then the admiral decided to head on back to Kwajalein. There had been no air attacks at that, in coordination with his naval landing at all. There had been no, so there was nothing for you on the AA guns to do, but to cheer everybody on, I guess, actually. So they beat a retreat, but also there wasn't over, because now VMF 211 pursued them on the way out with bombing attacks as well as strafing attacks, and started.
Captain Froehler put a bomb down the smokestack of one of them.
Yes, he did. As a matter of fact, it was Elrod, who I think
Elrod, yeah.
who put it down. Can I have that next slide, please? There's Captain Elrod.
Oh, yeah.
Later to get the Congressional Medal of Honor, but he put one right down and sank that one right away. And plus they strafed and did some other damage to the rest of that squadron as it was retreating. And then late in the afternoon, there was the evening patrol, and I forget the lieutenant's name, but he came up and spotted a Japanese submarine that was on the surface.
I remember that.
And he attacked that submarine by both strafing runs and then dropped his bombs, which went on both sides. And he watched that submarine sink under the waves.
I remember that.
So, and their attack had caused very little damage. I think maybe 5 Marines had been slightly wounded. And they had just had a devastating attack. In fact, later on it was reported that was probably the only instance in the Pacific War by Admiral Morrison in which coastal defense guns had beat off an amphibious assault. The only time it happened. So it had been a great day. But you didn't have very long to cheer, because Major Devereaux was sure that your battery position had been discovered during that attack that had happened at the noon attack. So he had you relocate back.
I remember that.
And so your battery that night, I'm going to go back to the map, was relocated from here at Toki Point over behind the Pan Am building, still on Peel, but you were relocated over there. So you had to work all night
Oh, yeah, I remember.
to move those 4 guns.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember the Morrison Knutson guys give Barron a hand on that?
Oh, yeah, and they all also put up some dummy guns in place of those we moved.
I think they left
4-inch
all your
pipes.
sandbag position and dummy guns,
Uh-huh.
and that kind of kept them off your back for at least the next couple of days.
Yeah.
But by the next morning, by the time the sun rose, the next morning you were up and ready.
Right.
I think they had about 250 helping you refill new sandbags
Yeah.
on that position. So Dan Teeter's folks really did yeoman work.
Yeah.
And then on day 12 there was no air attack except for, on the 12th, there was a float plane, which was
Oh, early in the morning.
early in the morning, but that was down by one of the F-4s from
Uh-huh.
but a huge float plane, and that was sunk. And there was no attacks that day or the next, and they think it was because that submarine was the one who was acting as a beacon for those incoming aircraft, and when it was sunk, they had to kind of stop and regroup
Yes.
before they could do much. Well, we'll stop at that particular point.
NCTV thanks the following station underwriters for their generous support. B&C True Value Home and Garden Center. For more than 60 years, striving to meet the needs of their customers and our community.
A message from the Foundation for a Better Life.